It's March 9th, 2019. I'll be talking to Alfred Zayas on the detention of Chelsea Manning, which happened yesterday. Welcome to Potkaars. So I'll skip lighting the candle and move into talking to Alfred Zayas, professor of international law, expert on human rights, and a retired senior lawyer for the Office of the High Commission of Human Rights. Now the reason, welcome Alfred Zayas.
Good day, happy to be here again.
Yeah, the reason I've invited you to discuss the situation with Chelsea Manning, which started yesterday, is that I was wondering, is this an American law situation that's happening, or is it also does it also go into human rights? So
obviously it goes into human rights,
yeah.
And we have here a classical case of what we term lawfare, is the misuse of the judicial branch to harass people. And this is being done more and more. I mean, it's being done, you've seen it in Argentina, you've seen it in Brazil, you see it in Colombia. And the United States is doing it, especially under Trump, quite systematically. And you can defend yourself, and he has good lawyers, Chelsea, and the lawyers are invoking the Bill of Rights, the amendments to the U.S. Constitution, in particular Amendments 1 and 4 and 5 and 6. Now, I find that Article 1, which deals with freedom of the press, freedom of expression, that is, of course, directly and indirectly touched, because what is here at issue is what did Chelsea Manning do, and what did Julian Assange do? They exercised the right of freedom of information. Chelsea provided the information to a news service, WikiLeaks, and that news service published it. So that is entirely legitimate, actually under Article 1 of the, or rather Amendment 1 to the U.S. Constitution. That is also covered and protected under Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And there's ample American case law on this issue, and also ample jurisprudence of the United Nations Human Rights Committee, of which I used to be the secretary. The problem being that they've already jailed the poor Chelsea. I mean, she already suffered 7 years of incarceration for doing something which should have gotten her an award, a human rights award. What did she do as a whistleblower? What did Assange do as a whistleblower? Informed us, informed American citizens like me, informed the world of the war crimes and crimes against humanity that the U.S. had been committing in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and elsewhere. This is crucial information. When a government hides its own crimes, in any democracy, it's absolutely indispensable to have access to this information so that you can hold your government accountable for these crimes that ultimately are being committed in your name. That's what I object to it. I'm an American, and all I can say, not in my name. The crimes that were committed in Iraq and in Afghanistan, and that are being committed in Yemen with American bombs, with American weapons, crimes that are being committed in Syria. I don't want to be responsible for that. I want my government to be held accountable for these war crimes and crimes against humanity. So Chelsea did an enormous service to humanity, and so did Julian Assange. When I was the independent expert of the United Nations on a democratic and equitable international order, I issued 2 press releases concerning Julian Assange. Among others, I endorsed and demanded the implementation of the judgment of the United Nations Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, which had found the situation of Julian Assange in the Ecuadorian embassy in London to constitute a violation of Article 9 of the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which is the article that protects security of person and the article that prohibits arbitrary detention. So Julian Assange has suffered arbitrary detention. Chelsea Manning suffered arbitrary detention for 7 years because her military trial, she should have had an absolute defense. And that's why I've been appealing to the High Commissioner for Human Rights, to the Secretary General of the United Nations, to make sure that the General Assembly adopts a charter of rights of whistleblowers, so that whistleblowers can have a defense when they take the risk and they publish something that the public must know. They should not be brought before a court. This is, shooting the messenger. Instead of holding George W. Bush, Tony Blair, and the others accountable for the war crimes and crimes against humanity, you are actually persecuting and prosecuting the individual who brought you the information which you had the right to have in the first place.
Yeah. Now, Chelsea Manning gave some information to WikiLeaks, which Julian Assange in turn published. She was put in jail for 7 years, but she was also released then after 7 years by the Obama administration. One of the last things Barack Obama did was release her, and under that administration, Obama also decided not to pursue juridical path with WikiLeaks. For fear of First Amendment rights, right?
Of course, they're contrary.
So what has changed? What has changed now? Because Chelsea Manning is not indicted; she was called to testify, to witness at a hearing for a jury. So what has changed now that Chelsea Manning was asked for a jury about WikiLeaks, apparently, but she, as far as I know, she's unaware. What exactly who's being persecuted and what are the charges?
Well, as you know, I'm an American lawyer. Actually, I'm a retired American lawyer. I do not practice and have not practiced in the United States for many years. I remain a professor of international law in Europe, but I'm not practicing. As the case may be, the grand jury system. I remember when I was a student at Harvard Law School, I was always very skeptical about the grand jury system, about the secrecy of it, about the lack of transparency. I think that is a major constitutional problem. And I would like to see that abolished or reformed. But the way it is right now, I think it is incompatible with certain safeguards that we have in the Constitution. And what has happened here is that we have a game of redefining words. Here you have the concept of freedom of the press, freedom of the media, which is protected both in international human rights law and in the US Constitution. So WikiLeaks is clearly a news service that enjoys this protection. In order to weasel out of this obligation to protect WikiLeaks, what does the Trump administration do? They redefine WikiLeaks as a foreign intelligence service or an enemy intelligence service. This is arbitrary. I mean, it reminds me, everybody knows Alice in Wonderland. It reminds me of the encounter of Alice with Humpty Dumpty. And there's a very interesting passage which I'll read out to you. When I use a word, Humpty Dumpty said in rather a scornful tone, it means just what I choose it to mean, neither more nor less. The question is, said Alice, whether you can make words mean so many different things. The question is, said Humpty Dumpty, which is to be master? That's all. In other words, if you have the power, as we know from Orwell in 1984,
exactly.
If you have the power, you make war mean peace, and you make hate mean love, and those paradoxes, those absurdities are possible if you have absolute power.
So I read up on the first response by Chelsea Manning to the questions, and she said, "I'm invoking First Amendment, Fourth Amendment, and Sixth Amendment." To my knowledge, she skipped the Fifth.
Yes, well, that is what was reported. I would be surprised if his lawyers had not pleaded the Fifth Amendment, because the Fifth Amendment says the following, that no person shall be subject for the same offense to be twice put in jeopardy of life, limb, nor shall he or she be compelled in any criminal case to be a witness against himself. So when there is a danger that they will trick you into a statement that may be contradictory to something that you said 7 years ago or 10 years ago, see, because that's part of the problem. Chelsea Manning cannot possibly remember everything that she said in the military court proceedings. And of course, the U.S. has all of the record. So you can phrase words in questions in a manner that will confuse Chelsea. Then she will say something, and then you can continue the harassment of Chelsea Manning by starting a new proceeding against her, possibly even for perjury.
Yeah, exactly.
I mean, this is the abuse of the rule of law to destroy the rule of justice. And that is what is happening in the United States. I've seen it in many other cases. I mean, Chelsea Manning is certainly not the only case. And because this type of lawfare is what you see in Argentina against Cristina Fernandez de Kirchner, what you see in Ecuador against Jorge Glass and against Rafael Correa, what you see in Brazil against Lula da Silva. This is serious stuff because it's a corruption of the judiciary, it's a corruption of the vocation of judges to be just, to weigh things and not to use the law as a weapon against political adversaries in order to intimidate and in order to suppress dissent. And that is what is happening. Yeah. And not only in the United States.
No. So now that we see Trump administration redefining who gets to call themselves press or not, so as to circumvent the First Amendment, freedom of press. So as long as you consider WikiLeaks to not be press, then you can maybe charge them. Now that Chelsea Manning chooses to not answer question of that jury, what would be her way forward from here?
Well, obviously she has good lawyers, and the lawyers are fighting this harassment of Chelsea Manning. But when you have a determined judge who wants to prosecute somebody, when you have a fanatical judge who wants to crush a defendant, he can get away with it. And of course, there are possibilities of appeal, and that can take a very long time. In the meantime, you rot in jail. And that in itself is intimidation of anybody else in the same situation as Chelsea Manning. So it's not that at the end of the day, you're not going to be acquitted. That is the same problem also with hate speech legislation, which has been so much abused in Europe and in the United States, hate crimes. The idea is you get indicted for something like that, totally unjust. Get yourself a lawyer, it costs you $50,000 to defend yourself. And then it takes 2 years of your life. And then in the end, you are acquitted. But you are exhausted. You've been humiliated. You've been harassed. And someone else is going to say, I'm going to watch it. I'm not going to speak my mind because the result is that I'm going to be victim of lawfare. Yeah. And that is what Chelsea is now suffering. And obviously, the United States is putting enormous pressure on Ecuador. I mean, it's blackmail, nothing less. So that Ecuador either expel Assange from the Ecuadorian embassy in London, where I visited him back in 2015, or that they turn him over to the British authorities. And now everybody knows that there is an existing indictment against Assange. And then the next thing, the United States demands extradition from the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom will extradite him. And this, of course, is a complete violation of the principle of non-refoulement. This principle is part of what we term jus cogens. This is peremptory international law. This is the hardest kind of hard law. It is just an absolute. On the other hand, if you have two governments that collude, they'll break the law with impunity. And who is going to call the United States or the United Kingdom to account? It's, I mean, a much bigger crime was 2003 when George W. Bush and Tony Blair attacked Iraq with a coalition of the willing. What was that? You had a revolt against international law. It was so clear that what they were doing was illegal. And who has been held accountable? Has the International Criminal Court indicted Tony Blair? Has it indicted George W. Bush and Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney and all the others who were directly involved in what may be the greatest violation of the Nuremberg principles since the Second World War? I mean, this was the most brazen genocidal attack on a people that was not threatening the United States or Great Britain or anybody else. And it was not only Bush and Blair who did it, but they dragged in 41 other countries, the coalition of the willing. So you see how weak international law is in preventing its own violation. And in the case of Manning, I see clear violations of Articles 7, 9, 10, 14, 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. The United States is a state party to this Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the only way you can criticize the United States is every 5 years when there is a state report being examined. And then you can say, well, you know, what did you do in the Assange case? What did you do in the Chelsea Manning case? But you cannot bring an individual complaint, as you can say in the European Court of Human Rights, that you bring a case in the name of this victim. That does not work vis-a-vis the United States, because the United States did not ratify the optional protocol to the Covenant on Civil and Political Rights.
Well, then there's also, just to wrap this thing up, the court, if you will, of public opinion. And yeah, you have the most powerful one that, just like it was explained to Humpty Dumpty, that gets the cold shots. Well, if there's information out there, and that's exactly what Julian Assange and Chelsea Manning.
not only the court of world public opinion. That, of course, depends on the media, whether the media is going to suppress this information and is not going to elucidate the problems. Are they going to say this is inconvenient facts and they will ignore them, which happens very often? So there's yet another avenue. People's courts. I don't know whether you know the Lelio Basso Foundation in Rome and the Brussels Tribunal, based on the tradition of Bertrand Russell and his People's Tribunals against the war in Vietnam. I mean, that is one way of trying to break the blackout in the information about Assange. Because in the case of Assange, he has been thoroughly defamed. There's a caricature of Assange out there in the media. I personally visited him in London, 2015, spent 3 good hours with him. The man is absolutely reliable. He is not playing games. I respect his integrity. I respect what he has done thus far, and that is why he's being punished. Interesting to remember, prior to 2010, when he had been revealing war crimes and corruption in Africa and Asia and other countries, he was showered with honors. He was considered to be one of the foremost human rights defenders. And then no sooner did he attack, or rather did he reveal the crimes of the United States, he became persona non grata, he became public enemy #1, and then they did all of this farce with this allegations of sexual harassment and even rape in Sweden. There again, lawfare, the misuse of the Swedish judicial system for purely political reasons in order to crush this person who had dared to point the finger at the United States.
Professor Alfred Zayas, thank you so much for your interview here. We'll talk again later.
I'm available whenever you want me.
Excellent. Take care.
Pleasure.
Bye-bye.